Hello and welcome to this special online dialogue on resisting a throwaway culture, protecting life and creation. My name is Molly Herrera and I'm the Program Director of Campus and Young Adult Ministry at the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of Washington. The Archdiocese is honored to be partnering on this dialogue with the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life at Georgetown University. Today's gathering is the second in a three-part series on Pope Francis, young people, and solidarity. Dialogues on Fratelli Tutti. For those of you who listened in to our first dialogue in this series on October 7th, you know that this series was not our idea. Pope Francis reached out to Cardinal Wilton Gregory, our pastor and Archbishop of Washington, through the President of the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Pope Francis asked if the Archdiocese of Washington would bring together young people in the nation's capital and beyond to discuss some of the ideas and challenges he wrote about in his encyclical letter, Fratelli Tutti, translated Brothers and Sisters All. The first dialogue held a month ago was centered around the question, who is my neighbor? A central theme of Fratelli Tutti based on the parable of the Good Samaritan. We had a terrific group of young leaders exploring what it means to be a neighbor to our sisters and brothers in Afghanistan with the unrest they are facing, in Haiti following the devastating earthquake, and in our own backyard in Washington, D.C. We've had over 1,800 people view the live stream and recorded video. The next and final dialogue in this series will be on December 2nd and will focus on the role of social media in a divided society. This special session today focuses on Pope Francis's call to resist a throwaway culture, particularly one that throws away and abandons the weak and vulnerable, the very young and very old, and neglects and damages God's creation. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis talks about a throwaway world where some parts of our human family can be readily sacrificed for the sake of others considered worthy of a carefree existence. For the next hour, we're going to explore what resisting this throwaway world looks like from our outstanding panel. I want to acknowledge as we begin the encouragement and assistance we received from leaders of Escolas Ocurrentes and our friends at the USCCB. Now let me introduce the five outstanding leaders joining us today. Charles Camosy is an associate professor of theological and social ethics at Fordham University and is author of several books, including Resisting Throwaway Culture, How a Consistent Life Ethic Can Unite a Fractured People. Rabbi Shoshana Friedman is a writer, mother, climate activist, and rabbinic ambassador for Dayenu, a multi-generational Jewish movement that confronts the climate crisis with spiritual audacity and bold political action. Shadea Parrilla is a Catholic campus minister at American University in Washington, D.C., and an advocate for human life and dignity, including issues like abortion and racism. Teresa Sosi is a member of the Navajo Nation and is a religious education director for St. Jude Catholic Parish in Tuba City, Arizona. She was a speaker at the 2021 Laudato Si and the U.S. Catholic Church Conference hosted by Catholic Climate Covenant. Bishop Joseph Tyson is the Bishop of Yakima, Washington. He is the Episcopal Liaison for Catholic Climate Covenant and is the chair of the USCCB Subcommittee on Pastoral Care for Migrants, Refugees, and Travelers. We hope you'll join the conversation by submitting your questions for participants using the email at the bottom of your screen. You can also share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Resisting Throwaway Culture and by tagging Wash Archdiocese, ADW Young Adults, and GUCST Public Life on Twitter. Now let's get started. Bishop Tyson, let's begin with you. You're a pastor and bishop who brings together the cry of the poor and the cry of the earth in your ministry and leadership. You're also the Episcopal Liaison of the Catholic Climate Covenant. What is the message of Fratelli Tutti for young leaders? And more specifically, why does Pope Francis call on us to resist a throwaway culture?
That's a great question and a great lead off. I would just take people back. When we had our ad limina visit with the Holy Father, Pope Francis, right before the shutdown for COVID, I had the opportunity to ask him that question. I said, in many of our parishes, there are two teams. There's the pro-life team and there's the social justice team. When he opened it, he said, I'm going to throw the ball out and who wants to kick first? And So I kind of played with that image. And he said this, what ties all the issues of life and justice together is this throwaway culture. It's very powerful in Spanish, los descargados. In other words, in Spanish, it really refers to packaging around a product. You use it and you throw it away. And what he was getting at is, whether we're talking about the fragile dying and the elderly or the unborn, the throwaway culture, he mentioned in that talk the migrant workers in Italy who live he was saying live on an airport runway. They go and harvest and then they live in tents on an airport runway. Now, this is kind of very key, that the throwaway culture is the linchpin that pulls together issues of life and justice. I'd say one more thing. Spiritually, tutti fratelli and Laudato Si are a diptych. I mean, this is one long Lectio Divina on the Canticle of St. Francis. It's one long prayer reflection. Tutti fratelli is a phrase from St. Francis of Assisi in his canticle. Laudato Si is the opening to the canticle. So I think underneath this is a profound and deep spirituality that that Pope Francis is really calling us to anchor ourselves in if we're going to resist this throwaway culture. So thanks.
Yeah, Bishop Tyson, that's beautiful and amazing that you were able to be in the room with Pope Francis and ask him that question. I want to ask you, what are the connections between care for the earth and care for the poorest people on earth, between defense of all life and defense and care for creation?
Well, let me just give one story. I mean, for my own pastoral ministry here, we have a small town, Bridgeport. It's about halfway between Yakima and Penticton, British Columbia. I'm out in the Northwest. When I was in Rome and somebody said you're from Yakima, they asked if that was a diocese in Japan. And I said, no, it's actually in the US. But little town, Bridgeport, the entirety of the Spanish speaking. The summer before last, we had terrible fires. We've had terrible fires here in the Northwest. The entire town was circled in flames. We evacuated with our little Caritas Católicas team, Caridades Católicas, Catholic Charities team, about 15 of our parishioner families. Most of the folks live in trailers. Well, these folks were first displaced for economic and dare I say drug war reasons from Mexico into this town of Bridgeport. It's a parish. We have no masses in English. It's all Spanish. And then the fire happened and they were secondarily replaced. One of the things we want to really pay attention to is displaced people are occurring not only because of war and violence, but also because of environment. I mean, literally, this was not a forest fire. The earth is drying out. So these are people twice displaced. I think that's where we want to be very attentive to the connection between issues of environmental justice and issues of justice for the poor.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking. Thank you, Bishop. Bishop, as a pastor and bishop of a diocese, how do you try to bring these principles to life in your home diocese? How can young people bring them to life?
Two things quick. We had the Bishop of Assisi here in Yakima, and then I got to visit him in Assisi. And there is this, this is a little bit about my own vision, which was you're asking. There's a room, it's a private room in the residence of the Bishop of Assisi that goes all the way back to Francis. It's El Salón de los Despojados. It's the room where Francis takes off his clothes and he gives them to his dad. And then there's a little painting over in the room. And the Bishop of Assisi turned to me and he said, that's the role. And what happens is the bishop takes off his coat and he puts it around the naked body of Francis. He said, that's our role, to protect the dreams of the young. Now, the flip side of that, our formation for our men, if you want to elevate the bread and wine, gifts of the earth and work of human hands, I expect everybody to lift a crate of apples. We all go pick fruit. This summer, we lived in the worker dorms with the migrant workers. We have 65,000 migrant workers in addition to the 188,000 Catholics. And I think it's making that personal connection we often have young adult that's interns with our seminarians and just participate. I actually had a man become a seminarian after being an intern. So, I mean, I think it's those kinds of personal, what Pope Francis would call, la cultura de encuentro, the culture of encounter. We want to provide those opportunities. I think that's really key. So thanks for those questions.
Yeah, that's so powerful. Thank you, Bishop. Charlie, we're going to turn to you. You wrote a book on resisting the throwaway culture. Help us understand where that phrase comes from and what it means. How does it challenge us?
First of all, thank you for inviting me to be with you. I don't appreciate having to follow Bishop, though. That was just amazing. So you're setting me up for failure here. Thanks, Bishop. Thanks, everyone. I spent the first 3 decades of my life under St. John Paul II. And so I was very influenced by his notion of a culture of death. And that was important and formative. And it highlighted a lot of things that needed to be highlighted, everything from the death penalty to abortion to unjust wars, including what he had to say about the Iraq War, by the way. But I think the phrase comes from Pope Francis, right? Resisting throwaway culture. He didn't invent it, but he kind of made it famous. I think throwaway culture captures something different from culture of death that's super important to highlight. We can kind of point a finger at someone who has an abortion or who participates in an unjust war, or those bad states that have the death penalty or something like that. We can talk about the other, right? And it's important to talk about that regarding justice and nonviolence and trying to make our polity a better one, a more just one, a more gospel-centered one, a more peaceable one. But what I think throwaway culture does, and the command to resist throwaway culture from Pope Francis does, is it kind of implicates all of us, right? It living within structures and systems that rely on throwing away not only the goods of the earth, but sometimes literal people, as Bishop just mentioned in several contexts: prenatal people, migrants, refugees from climate change, migrants and refugees from war. I even write, much to John's chagrin, about how we treat non-human animals and how throwaway culture just turns animals into protein units per square foot. So consumerism is one of the things that unites it all. It takes everything and thingifies it, including our most vulnerable people. And we're implicated in our participation in these structures. And it means that we have to do something. It's not just pointing the finger at somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a lot to think about. In many ways, the idea of resisting the throwaway culture blurs political boundaries. It's neither left nor right. Can this understanding help us think and act differently, resist our polarized politics? And if so, how?
It's a big undertaking. I've tried to make much of my career about doing precisely this, taking especially Pope Francis's vision for resisting throwaway culture and using it as a tool in the United States context that you just mentioned. I don't need to tell people probably on this call, we have a major Supreme Court case on abortion coming up that I think the oral arguments actually start in a month, and there will likely be a decision this summer. And I'm frequently worried about our ability to hang together as a polity, as a culture, depending how this goes. What I love about Pope Francis and what I love about his consistent view of the dignity of the human person and his call to resist the throwaway culture, which totally violates that dignity, is that it encompasses questions of human dignity which totally blow up the kind of polarized attack the other as obviously evil or wrong mindset that we have. And there are a number of ways you could talk about this. I wrote a whole book about it, but I guess I'll just mention two. Abortion let's start with abortion. So Pope Francis is sometimes known as the liberal Pope, has told us don't care about abortion so much. But actually, those remarks were taken way out of context. In fact, the very next day after he said, supposedly, we don't need to care about abortion, he told a bunch of OBGYNs in Rome that the prenatal children bear the face of Christ in a very special way. And I think you can make an argument, actually, that the Holy Father our current Holy Father, has said the most hardcore things about abortion of any pope that has existed in my lifetime, maybe even going back even further than that. It's a classic example of throwaway culture, right? It's a voiceless population. It's a population at risk for terrible violence. They're deeply inconvenient to those who have power over them. And Pope Francis has rightly said, we don't need to choose between the vulnerable populations. Sometimes women are vulnerable. Prenatal children are by definition vulnerable. And resisting throwaway culture means speaking up for their dignity, being a voice for the voiceless. But he always connects, at least in my experience, he always connects that view to other issues, right? To say, hey, guess what? There's a lot of structures and systems which treat women as throwaway populations as well, right? That especially in the Bronx where I teach, the abortion rate hovers around 45, 50% of all pregnancies. There is just tremendous grinding poverty, generational poverty. Also, intimate partner violence plays a huge role. Often men are deeply involved in coercing abortions that women don't want to have. So I could say more about this, but the vision of throwaway culture that allows Pope Francis to talk about both the dignity of the prenatal child and the dignity of women, and then to talk about not throwing away either population, but treating them equally as equally bearing the image and likeness of God, could be a really powerful antidote to the kind of problems that your question highlighted.
Thanks, Charlie. Shadea, we're going to move on to you. You're a Catholic campus minister at American University. What aspects of resisting the throwaway culture do college students find challenging, and which do they lean into?
It's a really good question, Molly. I've been working in campus ministry for going on 2 years now, and it's really interesting how college students engage with this topic. I think it varies in general. It varies upon their background and their political affiliation. But in general, I've seen, especially here at American University, we are one of the most politically active campuses in the nation, and many of our students lean more towards the liberal side. And as such, the younger people, my generation, are much more adept at leaning into, we need to resist systemic racism. We need to fight against that. That is an evil that needs to be eradicated. They're much more adept at, yes, we need to embrace the responsibility we have to fight against climate change, to be stewards of our earth. But on the flip side, they struggle with rejecting the evil of abortion. And so, for instance, around 2 years ago, we started a Students for Life Club here at American University. It was my last brouhaha of my senior year. And I handed it on to other students who are still involved in our ministry now. And those students found it very difficult to engage with other students on campus. There's automatically a perception of abortion as being something that's a bit too sensitive to speak about. There are a lot of emotions involved in the conversation as well. It's a lot of background that each person brings to the conversation. And so our students find it very, very difficult to look someone in the face and tell them abortion is evil and we need to fight against it. At the same time, embrace that person and have them know, but I care about you. If you've had an abortion, I don't want to reject you and your dignity. And so our students often struggle between those two things, wanting to be advocates for women and feminists. Many of our students identify as such, and a feminist, I believe in the importance of women in our society and defending them, but then at the same time, embracing what the church teaches about the evil of abortion.
Thanks, Shadea. Young people, like many in our country today, struggle with polarizing rhetoric that can often divide us. As a young Catholic who's an advocate for both life and social justice issues, how do you see the values and teachings of our faith as something that can bring us together in resisting a throwaway culture?
It's a really good question. Honestly, in my beginning of my college experience, I was not super deeply involved in my faith. And I had an experience that brought me deeper into the church, that maybe helped me to embrace it as this is mine. And in that time, I saw the world through a very different lens than I do now. And I have found that the church and what we teach has been the most powerful tool for understanding the dignity of the human person, and then from that, being able to defend it. So for instance, last year, I put on this Black History Month over at Oregon State University for the Newman Center there. And we were working with trying to educate students, staff about what is Black history, how does that relate to the church? Oregon is a predominantly white state, and the Newman Center as such serves a predominantly white student population. And the students are struggling with, why do I need to learn this? How does this affect me? And then in some cases, struggling with, I don't want to take on this responsibility of fighting systemic racism because it somehow is in contrast or is in conflict with what I learned growing up, with what my family believes, with what the people I admire politically, what they say. But we were able to use theology of the body as a major way of teaching the students, like your body, a person's body has dignity. And so what happens to it matters. And then also teach them we had this session where we spoke about the history of racism and that it is an intrinsic evil as identified by the church. But then we also led them through this examination of conscience that was written by a priest, and had each person do the interior spiritual work. And these are concepts that are easy for Catholics to understand, that there is evil that we are responsible for, that we play some part in. And the Lord desires to speak into that. And we have a responsibility as a church to fight against things that negate our dignity. And so we're able to use these teachings of the church, theology of the body, the beauty of the sacraments. We had an adoration service to help unite us under our shared identity as Catholics, as sons and daughters of God. And then through that, have really, really powerful conversations. It was really beautiful seeing this Black History Month take place and seeing how our identity was able to unite us on a deeper level. And then from that, we could talk about things that were difficult. I had a number of very difficult conversations with people who I still see as some of my best friends, who didn't see the issue in the same way that I did. And we were able to wrestle with it because we believed at the very basic level, we are sons and daughters of God. And you love the Lord, I love the Lord. Okay, so let's have a real conversation.
Shadea, one more question for you. Why do young people find care for creation such an important issue? Why do your students or your friends that you're connected to, why do they find that to be such an important issue?
I think our students are, myself included, my friends, are growing up in a world that is so interconnected through technology, through social media, through different avenues of receiving the news, that they're much more connected to how climate change is affecting real lives. And so I've seen, something happens in another part of the world and it automatically comes to us. We're able to witness it, to see the suffering. And it makes us a lot less, I think, disconnected from the reality that other people are experiencing. I think sometimes we can see climate change or see a lack of care for creation as something very far removed from us. And we're able to stay in that bubble and be very comfortable there. But because of this age of technology, we're able to connect much more readily with it. For instance, 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago, there were 2 Category 5 hurricanes that happened in the Virgin Islands, where I'm from. And people were able to connect with the reality that what we're doing to our earth is warming oceans, it's making hurricanes more severe, and it's hurting people's lives. People are suffering as a result of that. And then they're able to take it on and want to do something about it.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Shadea. Rabbi Friedman, we're going to turn to you. The leadership of Pope Francis and the message of Fratelli Tutti cross religious lines. Rabbi Friedman, you're a leader in the Jewish community. How does Pope Francis's message connect our two communities?
Thank you, Molly, and thank you so much for having me. I'm going to have to start my remarks with an unplanned comment. I am 39 years old. I had an abortion when I was 30. It was the most life-affirming choice I could make out of a very, very difficult moment. I spoke to the soul of that little being. I spoke to God. The language that all 3, Bishop Tyson, Charlie, and Shadea, you have each thrown out to my face has been deeply hurtful, upsetting, and very invisibilizing. And I need to raise awareness that when you are on a call with 400 other people and someone you don't know, the likelihood that women have had an abortion is almost 100%. And as you go through your lives as leaders, please remember that. I also need to attach to that unfortunately, I hear the Catholic Church talk about abortion. I do not see, at least in Boston, I've been involved in progressive life-affirming politics and justice work, and the Catholic Church is absent. And so if you want me to take you seriously on abortion, you need to show up against gun control. You need to show up against systemic racism. You need to show up against mass incarceration, and you need to show up against animal suffering. It is not going to fly to do this cross-cultural work as people who have these progressive values if abortion stays at the front and center. Thank you. The way I thought that this conversation was going to go was about my understanding of throwaway culture, which has to do with how we treat the Earth's resources and how extractive capitalism hurts people, the Earth, and animals and plants, and the systems that we depend on. And the story I want to tell is that when I was a child, I was given the messaging that I think most of us have been given, that my individual consumer choices were what mattered, and that I could, quote unquote, save the world or make a difference with my choices. And so as an 8-year-old who deeply wanted to save this beautiful planet, I started to become very obsessive about my behavior, including being concerned every time I threw something away, every time I used the water or a paper towel. And this kind of obsessive thinking started to become a really painful part of my life, and I felt very isolated. My work as a rabbi is in many ways a healing from that lonely child. I was trained as a community organizer and then as a rabbi. And what I understand to be real is that the power that we have is not in our consumerism, that actually was, and I have an article on this that I could put in the chat later, but or could be posted perhaps, that personal choice as the way to somehow that we could consume our way out of the ecological crisis was a very intentional lie fed to us by industry. And we've lost decades of active consumer, active citizen engagement on environmental regulation and industry regulation because we were all focused on our own little way of resisting throwaway culture. That doesn't cut it. Clearly, even if all of us drove electric cars, and recycling anyway is mostly a gimmick to make us feel better. About 9% of plastic since the 70s has been recycled, so you can't feel good about plastic. You know, it's all just gimmicks to help us to skew our voice and our attention away from regulating industry and making the policy changes that we needed to make decades ago. And so, for me, what resisting throwaway culture looks like and the way that we can work together across religious and cultural lines and across the polarity in our country is through mass mobilization. I point to the work that Diane is doing and to Sunrise, the Sunrise movement, which I hope people who are tuning in know, that when you get people who are actively engaged together, organizing on policy at the local, at the municipal, state, and federal levels, we start to move the dial and we get something like Biden's climate proposals, which may or may doesn't look very hopeful, but without the Sunrise movement, we would never have had this as one of the top issues of the last election and what we're working for now. So mass mobilization and taking to the streets, civil disobedience and peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience, doing that together, the most important activist work, the most meaningful moment in my life so far as an activist was blocking a pipeline project with many other faith leaders, with 16 of us, and putting my body where it counted, as opposed to using my brain to just obsess about my own little actions. And we are all implicated in extractive capitalism, and there's no way out, right? So we can spend a lot of time being exhausted and making ourselves crazy trying to buy the exact right thing or consume our way out of this. And yes, there are better and worse consumer choices, but that's not where our attention needs to be right now. It needs to be on joining hands to mobilize and show power in the streets.
Rabbi Friedman, I appreciate your deeply personal remarks, and there are different and strongly held views on abortion and other issues. We hope we can find ways to work together even when we disagree. I love the work that you have done with Dayenu. Can you talk a little bit about how we can work together on policy at the local level?
That's interesting. It wasn't exactly where I was going to go, but let me take that. Let me take that in a direction that I hope will be helpful. Often, getting the easy answer to that is get the right people in office. So I'm really proud that in Boston we just elected Michelle Wu to be our mayor-elect as of Tuesday, and she's a really, really strong climate champion. And so working on local elections, if you're able to do that, or to do get out the vote work, if you have to be nonpartisan or not supporting a specific candidate, if you're doing it through your church or whatnot. But if you can volunteer for campaigns to get people into the primaries who are strong climate or justice champions, that's one thing for sure. The other thing I want to say, just on a more broad note, I spend a lot of time speaking to people and helping folks move through the despair and the paralysis that is natural and healthy as we're coming out, as many people are waking up to the intensity of the emergency around us, both the climate and the ecological crisis writ large. And folks in general feel really paralyzed. We don't know what to do. And so I really try to put out the idea of an immune system. And in an immune system, it's a decentralized response to a threat. And every cell has a job. And the system doesn't work very well if all the cells try to do the same job. And you need all of those differentiated cells to do their work. And they're doing differentiated work. And my view, both scientifically and metaphysically, is that we are manifestations of the consciousness of the planet. I don't think that's a stretch. We come from the planet. Every atom in all of our bodies came from her. And the consciousness in our lives comes from her as a manifestation of divinity. And that means that we are responding to a threat to our own body, the body of the earth. And we are acting, those of us who are called to be active in these movements, whatever that looks like for us, are acting as immune cells, like immune cells, in a decentralized way to a massive global threat. And the reason I really love that metaphor is, and that I hope that it helps anyone out there who's feeling like nothing I do is enough, nothing I do is going to make the right kind of difference or a big enough difference, is look inside yourself, do some soul searching. What are the things that bring you joy? And what are the things that light you up? And maybe that's art, and maybe it's speaking, and maybe it's writing, and maybe it's watching kids. Maybe it's making food. Literally every one of those skills, making spreadsheets, it can all be used for this movement to sustain life on this planet. And then you just want to find a local chapter of whatever group, Mothers Out Front if you're a parent, Sunrise if you're younger, whatever the faith-based groups are that of whatever tradition you are involved in, and give those skills to that group, and find in that, I would bless you that you would find in that a deeply meaningful part of your life, and that the climate crisis and the other crises we face might become, in addition to the deep heartbreak, the deep, deep, deep heartbreak, might also become a point of meaning and fulfillment for your soul, because you are putting yourself in service in the best way that you can, which for human beings is ultimately the most rewarding thing.
Thank you, Rabbi Friedman. That is really powerful, especially for young people on really taking action and doing our part. Bishop Tyson, Rabbi Friedman talked about joining hands to mobilize together and called on the Catholic Church to be there in the trenches. How can we do that, and how are you doing that?
I certainly heard, Rabbi, thank you, because I heard the pushback on the abortion, but I also really hear and would say there is a real profound need to have a consistent, I think your challenge around you got to show up for the other things is right on target. And I want to really affirm that. Now, I know it's a sensitive point. I have been very clear about saying, if you want to save the unborn, you have to be willing to work. You have to be willing to walk through the doors of the undocumented. You have to be able to take on this legal status of their extended families, which is mainly my diocese. You have to be able to deal with the poverty issues. You have to deal with their extended families that have fled violence south of the border. There's more to saving a baby than stopping an abortion. So I know we probably don't see completely eye to eye on that, Rabbi, but I also really appreciate the challenge that we really have to help. We have had an unbalanced catechesis on this. You can't just cherry pick one issue. Now, obviously, that preeminent language that's perhaps difficult for you and for some of the others, it's that, if you're going to work on walking the journey with the woman and not simply go around her freedom to save the child, if you're going to walk that journey with a woman, you've got to walk the whole journey. And that's kind of where I'm sure there are folks who have a variety of passions on the Zoom call with different pieces of the walking together from womb to tomb. But hopefully we can have a respect for each other's passions in order to really uplift the gift of life at every single stage. I would say that's really, Pope Francis, as Charlie, you noted, has some very strong language on abortion. But underneath that, we're hearing a solid challenge from the Holy Father to show up, on the other things that you're pointing out, Rabbi. So I hope that helps a little bit. And I thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate being heard. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Teresa, we're going to go to you now. Teresa, you are a member of Navajo Nation and have worked closely with the Catholic Climate Covenant. First, I know it is traditional in your culture to introduce yourself with your clans. Would you be able to introduce yourself for us and tell us about your background and what drew you to this work?
Yes, just real quick. It is traditionally for me as a Navajo to introduce myself clan-wise, even though I know a lot of you are not Navajo or Native American, but you are, technically my church family. So you are part of my family. So I will introduce myself in Navajo. And yeah, briefly on my background, I am currently the DRE here in Tuba City, Arizona, and I am the leader for Kateri Circle, which is Kateri Tekakwitha. She is our patron saint for ecology, and she's the first Native American saint. And how I got into the work with Catholic Climate was just by chance, with working with the USCCB and just I think they got word of how with my small parish, we did go green. We were in our Kateri circles. I was trying to figure, what we could do besides just the regular meetings, every month. And I mimicked our St. Vincent de Paul Society of a reflection and then a meeting. And so I approached Sister Catherine. She is the daughter of Charity. And I asked her, if she could, she can put it to where others could understand La Delta C. And so we were doing that. And I think within the 3rd, 4th month we were doing that, I approached Father Jay and I said, we can't just, do these reflections and talk about it. We actually have to put this in action. And so me, him, and my boss at the time, Sister Mary Freight, we sat down and we came with a plan. And this was right before COVID started and we were getting the ball rolling. And the one thing that we did put a stop to was our plastic use. We stopped our plastic use, no more plastic water bottles, because I know that was the main thing we sat down and looked at, and it was the use of plastic water bottles and utensils. And, so I researched and I saw this company, I think it was in Atlanta, they do like this bamboo with utensils, paper, like paper plates, and everything. And so we only got to use that once because we have this big arts and crafts, like I guess show, you could say it's a bazaar. And we sell food and we can only use it once, and then COVID hit, and then we have all this waiting to be used. So that's a little bit of my background.
That's great. Thank you, Teresa. How do you see the throwaway culture in your particular context, in your church or community? How can we resist it?
Especially with me, like, with being Native American and, just growing up since we were little, we were taught, you take care of Mother Earth will take care of you. And it's the same way, I would think as in your prayer life, you pray and if you pray, you're good, I'll use quotes, you're a good person, things will come back to you in full. So it's the same way here. And so for me, and how to resist it is just what I've been doing within my church. I thought for sure I would get one or two people like, why are we doing this? Because I do still have friends who use plastic, who use styrofoam, who, even though no matter how many times, I tell them, and show them, and especially here, I don't know who it was. I think Shadea, you were talking about how you do see the effects of climate change. And I live on the reservation, and you do see that. You see that heavily. This past summer was a hard summer for us. We had drought. It's November. We should be getting into winter season. It's still very warm. And so for me, how we resist it is just by doing the little things that I can do, especially within my parish. But where Navajo Nation is strict lockdown, still we're one of the very strict lockdowns because we were hit with COVID very, very hard. And, so I try, as I can, trying to do the advocacy of, this climate change, what we can do.
That's great. Thank you so much, Teresa. Charlie, I want to pose a question to you. Consumerism is something that unites us all. How can we resist that consumerism in our personal lives? And if anyone else wants to weigh in on that statement.
The way that the Holy Father has set this up, at least in my reading of him, is that we resist a consumerist throwaway culture by taking time to create and participate in a culture of encounter, so that it's our consumerist acts, our acts of consumption should involve more than hitting two buttons on our smartphone and something showing up outside our door in 24 hours or less. We should connect ourselves to the means of production, connect ourselves to how those that made the product we're going to consume were treated, what they were paid, the effect that the production and shipping of the product we're consuming has on our earth, and also specifically on climate change. And I come back to animals here again, much to the chagrin of John. I have a whole chapter in Resisting Throwaway Culture on animals, and I don't see a way, frankly, and I wish more of my fellow theologians would talk about this, though there are some, thinking more about how our consumerist habits with regard to our food affects global climate change is just maybe more important than anything else, especially relative to what I hear, because the factory farms that produce most of the cheap meat we consume are the most important contributors to global climate change, more than anything else we participate in. And so again, that culture of encounter, if we're going to purchase food and meat, we need to connect to the means of production and engage local systems and people, frankly, people, right? Encounter people, so we can resist throwaway culture that way. That's the consumerist throwaway culture falls when we focus on a culture of encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. Shadea, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that we can resist consumerism, and I liked a lot of what Charlie shared. But also I think in using using more community-oriented ways of living. So I currently live in what we call it community lifestyle, an intentional Christian community, and so we share food together. And so we buy our food together, and then we share those meals. But then through that, we're able to lessen our waste by having a more structured way in which we eat. We reduce our amount that we're consuming fast food, which, as we know, is not contributing well to the issue we're facing with climate change. And then we encourage our students to do that as well. We have here, both in our ministry at AU, but then also in our ministry at Oregon State, what we call the Households Program, where we encourage students to do the exact same thing, to live in households, intentional Christian community together in a family lifestyle, where you are able to share more of what you're using. We encourage them to, in Oregon, it's very popular as well, to do things like recycle, to use compost, to make more sustainable choices, to share clothing. I think those are very small things that you do in your family, with your family, that you can do in college with your friends by being intentional.
Great. Bishop Tyson, do you have any thoughts on how we can resist consumerism in a practical way? And then after this, we're going to turn to questions from our audience. But Bishop, I'd love to hear from you.
Oh, thank you. Well, these are profound answers we're already getting. I think I've got two thoughts that are running in my head as I listen. And I want to be calibrated on this first one because we can't spiritualize the problem away. But this prayer is spiritual. We need a profound interior conversion. And that's sacraments, that's liturgy, that's worship, that's prayer, that's reflection, that's silence. I mean, it's back to the fact that Laudato Si e Tutti Fratelli are really Elexio Divina on a prayer psalm, the canticle. I guess the other piece, and this is a little more abstract, the other concept that Francis talks about in more in Laudato Si is this integral human development. In other words, like, as the rabbi and I just had this exchange, every issue is interrelated to every other issue. You touch one issue, it's a mobile. And so I think it's also beginning to help our people draw the connections between drug trafficking, crop replacement, climate change, immigration, cultural dislocation in small towns of rural America from Anglophone to Hispanic, then the climate change. In other words, these are all interrelated realities. That's why I think we have to really be working on our interior spiritual lives to have an open heart and an open mind. I'll say the last thing here. When Francis talks about, and Charlie, and maybe some of you know this better than I do, when the Pope Francis talks about la cultura reencuentro, he is not talking about let's all eat ethnic. No, this is coming together in our very sharp, stark differences. This isn't about having an encounter with our Facebook group. It's actually being outside of our bubble with people who are starkly different from us. The Holy Father is very good about emphasizing this edgy, rough sandpaper aspect of what it really means to be in a culture of encuentro. So thanks for letting me pop in there.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for your different reflections on Fratelli Tutti. Just a reminder for our audience to send your questions into Cath Social Thought at georgetown.edu. And we are starting to get a lot of questions. And so we'll get to your questions soon. I do want to ask a question of the entire panel. Maybe Rabbi Friedman, we can start with you. We have a question about how COVID-19 has revealed the throwaway culture in a new way. How has this affected your community?
Yeah, I mean, I in a major way. So just to affirm the question asker, I think when COVID started, one really big impact that this has had on my community, but I would probably say most of us, was, okay, systems are falling apart faster than we thought. Time to recalibrate. So as a climate activist, I've lived with a sense of endings and grief and unraveling for a long time. I know that folks who are dealing with systemic racism, on their bodies in this country have lived with endings and grief and injustice and devastation for centuries. And there are and those who are living in poverty, and yet there are still huge segments of our society that, especially since World War II, have lived in this continent with a sense of abundance and invulnerability that COVID shattered. And I want to be very delicate here because it's not in what I'm about to say, because I God forbid it should be taken the wrong way. But I do think that there was, one would hope it never had happened, but given that the pandemic happened, there is some blessing there. Again, not the suffering, not the death, but the wake up call that that climate change, that pandemics, that the global interconnected system is more vulnerable than it looks like when those of us who have privilege are sitting in our homes. And so I think the really big impact, honestly, that I saw was people waking up and getting more involved. The Dayenu, the organization that I do this work for, launched in April of 2020. And that's an intense time to launch an organization. And yet it's been incredibly successful. And part of that is something shifted. Like those of us who have been on the vanguard of the climate movement for a decade have been like, hello, when is everyone going to wake up? And it's like, oh, okay. I guess the answer to that is roughly March of 2020. People are activated. And so that's fabulous. The terrible part is that it has, just like every other exacerbating factor, like climate change, COVID is what we call a force multiplier. And so the devastation of it, of course, landed most heavily in this country on people of color, on the poor, and the economic disparities, of course, landed most heavily there. And in fact, disgustingly, this has been economically fruitful for those of us with stocks, which makes me want to gag. It's like, how is it possible that this has happened, and yet those who have are just getting more? So I really hope that the impact continues to be a wake-up call, and that as vaccines roll out and parts of the country, things sort of return to a semblance of normal. Normal wasn't working, right? Normal wasn't working. It was working for some of us, but only for a short amount of time. I mean, climate change is coming whether we have a vaccine or not. And so to, again, find the posse of people who bring you to life and who can use your skills to play your role as an immune system cell. Hopefully, if it wasn't climate change, then the pandemic would be the little kick in the heart to get going on that.
Yeah, absolutely, Rabbi Friedman. That's such a kind of wonderful example that even though in this pandemic, we want to be kind of on the outside and on the other side of it, but we're still very much in it, and we're still realizing and seeing how interconnected we all are in the pandemic with COVID-19. That COVID-19 doesn't have borders, and that we all are connected to each other in this way. Teresa, I also wanted to ask you, how has COVID-19 affected your community? Has it revealed the throwaway culture to you in a new way?
Just to mimic, Rabbi's statement, it did awaken us, and it did bring light to, I think people were still shocked that, a majority of the Navajo Nation is without running water and electricity. And how do we beat COVID is by washing our hands. And so, my community was hit the most, and we've been devastated. We have, multi-generational homes, and that's the reason why it hits so hard. And so for me, how COVID impacted us, it brought a lot of awareness to us. And I think otherwise no one would still know. And unfortunately, it did, with this, it brought, the government did give us money, but, without that, I think we wouldn't have been able to give, running water to a lot of people who couldn't afford it. And so for me, hearing, other people in their privilege on, my community, we just need to wash our hands. And that's the reason why it was so hard. You couldn't do that here. My sister works with Johns Hopkins, and they did, washing stations. And that was another way that my church helped, the parish helped. We housed the wellness boxes that they did. And so for me, it's just been, I'm trying to find it's really hard to find the positive in what COVID-19 has done. But it just, when it hits your community very, very hard. And I've had friends who passed away from it, who survived a war, and this hits them and you don't understand it. And that was my struggle. He survived a war and he comes back and this is what kills him. I have my brother-in-law, his wife passed away from it. Just recently, I learned a close family friend, her daughter just passed from it. So I'm still being, we're still being affected by this. And so if everyone could please pray for my community, because we're hitting the surge again, and it's devastating.
Teresa, thank you so much for sharing that. And please know of our prayers and how sorry we are for your loss and your family and your community. Bishop Tyson, I want to pose the same question to you. How has COVID-19 revealed the throwaway culture in a new way for us?
Well, I mean, in a nutshell, I think about it, and I'm with you, Teresa, and it's horrible. The losses. In March during the peak, we had the third highest COVID infection in the United States. I had a funeral for a man working his name was David Munoz, 3 children. And, it just hit and he died. We had the funeral. I mean, we had 60% of our workforce was considered essential by the state. And they were working, cheek to jowl in fruit packing plants without any protective gear. And we couldn't get any. I mean, you could not buy a thermometer or a mask to save your life. And the front end of this really was some of our most vulnerable, minimum wage workers in the food industry here. So it does rip open the social inequities, the haves and the have-nots. And it is a really difficult, reality that has been opened up. I say this one other thing, and I know it's a sensitive topic, but, I suspect about a fourth of my diocese is undocumented. Well, these people, they weren't eligible for CARES Act. Now, we had to scramble and find ways to make sure everybody's cared for, regardless of their legal status, but also target those families, particularly our restaurant workers and our hospitality workers when the shutdown occurred. It was just really, I don't know that we all realized how many have-nots there were, especially those. I mean, I could go on, but the stories of dealing with folks who were not eligible for the CARES Act because of their legal status, it's quite profound and quite challenging. So thanks for the call out.
Thanks, Bishop. We're about to wrap up. Charlie, I'd love your thoughts before we do our final wrap up. Charlie, what are your thoughts on this?
Just very quickly, I'd just mention our elderly, and particularly our elderly with dementia, as being a population that was definitely treated as a throwaway population during the pandemic. I mean, they're already treated like a throwaway population. We literally push them off into other places and discard them so they can die mostly alone anyway. But the pandemic obviously put that on steroids. I would also take the risk of saying there's a silver lining here as well. Maybe we've been woken up a little bit to this, and we need to find a way to build a culture of encounter with our elderly, especially those suffering from dementia.
Thanks so much, Charlie. As we wrap up, I want to ask each of you for a brief closing comment. In what ways is the throwaway culture a challenge to believers and young people? And what is one thing we can do to resist it? Shadea, let's start with you.
Thank you, Molly, for having me for this lecture, this panel. It's been amazing to hear everyone's thoughts and perspectives. I think that it's very important to be consistent. So we've spoken earlier about the importance of consistency when speaking about life, because I've found that there's a tendency to dissociate from the dignity of other people, especially when those people don't agree with us or don't quite see the world the same way that we do. And I think one of the best ways that we can, in our everyday life, resist a throwaway culture is by embracing conversations with those who disagree with us, who also tell us, what you've done to me, what you said to me hurts. I've had that experience with friends when I'm talking with them about racism, about, hey, this is my experience. This is what has happened to me, to my family. These are the ways that our country says I don't have dignity as a Black woman. And this is how your perspective, your failure to acknowledge that affects me, how it fails to affirm my dignity. And it's been difficult for them to hear that and try to embrace that. And in a similar vein for me, when someone says to me, hey, what you said about, what you shared earlier, Rabbi Friedman, about abortion, that affects me, that hurts me. And it's important for us when someone says something like that to us, to in that moment, affirm that person's dignity by being able to listen, to hear someone say to us, I disagree with you, and here's why, and here's how you've hurt me. And then to move from that. I think It is one of the simplest, but also simplest in that we encounter it the most. We can encounter it the most, but also one of the most difficult because it requires a putting down of our own pride, our own desire to be right, to be heard, to be seen, to let someone else be heard, be seen, and be affirmed in that moment.
Thank you so much, Shadea. And I do think that highlights a lot of what Pope Francis is calling us to do, to engage in dialogue, even when it's difficult, and to have those moments of encounter, even when it's difficult. Teresa.
Yes, I really would mimic Shadea. You know, you have those conversations like and challenge one another. I think that's one thing you have to do, and also pray. You know, like for me, I do with almost anything, I try and pray to Saint Kateri, especially because she is, you know, our patron saint of ecology. I think that's one way to do it, but I totally agree with Shadea. You have to have those uncomfortable conversations, and also too, you know, with me being on the Navajo Nation and not having those readily you know, the access to everything, you know, like a major city would, you know, you be the one to start that in your community. And then after that, it'll be easier and easier for that. And I think also just try and find those connections. You know, it is difficult for me, but, you know, I always think if a small Navajo Nation parish in Arizona can go green, and it's what's stopping you. And so I think that is, and then also to thank you for this invitation. And I would like to say, Dien God, Nick Jolindo, God bless you all.
Thank you, Teresa. Charlie.
Let me just quickly affirm what's been said about encountering people outside of your bubbles and your own particular communities of ideology. I think that's just absolutely essential to resisting throwaway culture, especially if we're going to move forward together as we can. There is just wild common ground out there to have, even if we disagree. I will say, since it's especially geared towards young people, to pick up on my comments just earlier, a culture of encounter that's intergenerational, I think, is just ridiculously important. I've been thinking about this a lot lately. There are two main groups of people who are desperately lonely, lacking relationships, depressed and anxious and alone for the most part. And it's young people and old people. And I thought, well, can't the church especially be a locus of encounter between generations, especially younger people and older people? That would be, I could go into a 10-minute rant about why that's important, but I've just as a suggestion to young people, there's a whole way to encounter your fellow human beings that is largely unexplored, and I think would be mutually beneficial in dramatic ways.
Thanks, Charlie. Rabbi Friedman.
I would say if there's one thing, it's to keep your eye on the big picture. Just what I said in the beginning, systemic change is what we need. Every single 1/10 of a degree matters when it comes to the climate crisis. And so we got to keep fighting, even though we're losing, we still have to keep fighting because there are still wins to be had. And then it's as we're doing that, we need to keep in touch with our own souls, because it's very difficult to take action at a time where things look so bleak. And there are resources, and I would put a plug for Joanna Macy's work, the work that reconnects. There are resources to move through despair and to look in your own faith tradition and own sacred history for ways of moving forward, even when things look bleak. And the last thing I'll say is put a plug for using personal pronouns for the more than human world. So I use he, or they pronouns when talking about plants or wild animals, and it really helps to transform the English speakers it and that to a thou and a who. And it's an easy spiritual practice you could start right now.
And Bishop Tyson.
Or you could learn Spanish and do that. No, those are excellent. I guess the only thing I would add to the mix here would be, and it's just a variation because it's been all said, is physically moving. I mean, I'm blessed with seminarians who are willing to physically live with me, and we work and live with the workers in the dorm, or physically going out to the migrant camp. I mean, those are things that we do. Physically moving out of the bubble, finding those opportunities to really have a personal, not a virtual, not a digital, a personal encounter with people starkly different from ourselves, who look different, speak different, and think different. And how do we go through their door? This is, I think goes back to Pope Francis and his dream of the missionary option, where we go out of ourselves. So great question. And I'm grateful to many examples I've been given on that as well.
Thank you, Bishop. Our hour is over, but this conversation will continue as the Archdiocese of Washington and the Initiative host our final conversation in this special series, Pope Francis, Young People in Solidarity, Dialogues on Fratelli Tutti. Join us Thursday, December 2nd, for a discussion on the role of social media in a divided society. We want to thank in a special way the leaders of Escolas Ocurrentes and our friends at the USCCB who have encouraged, assisted, and inspired us in this outreach to young people. They are a great example of Fratelli Tutti in action. Thanks to all who helped us on the technical end of this dialogue, and I want to offer special thanks to John Carr, Kim Daniels, and Anna Gordon at the Initiative, and my colleagues Janine Marino and Father Charlie Cordonovas for their efforts to put this terrific conversation together. Just a reminder that this discussion has been recorded and will be posted on the Georgetown Initiative's website and social media channels for sharing, and you can also see follow-up resources from the conversation posted there as well. Finally, please join me in thanking these amazing leaders who have informed and inspired us: Charles Camosi, Rabbi Shoshana Friedman, Shadea Parrilla, Teresa Sosi, and Bishop Joseph Tyson. Thank you, and we'll see you on December 2nd.